Chapter 1. The Cancelled Flight. The announcement came without apology. A flat, metallic voice rolled through the terminal speakers, something about operational issues and weather congestion in the corridor, followed by the word canceled. Keith Rice didn't react at first. He sat in the molded plastic chair at gate 47, boarding pass folded neatly between his fingers, carry on a line square with his feet. Around him, irritation bloomed loudly. Phones lifted, voices sharpened. Someone swore under their breath. Keith stayed still, eyes fixed on the darkened window, where the reflection of the terminal lights trembled faintly. Cancelled. Not delayed. Not pushed back an hour. Cancelled. He checked his watch. 9:38 p.m. The airline agent began talking about hotel vouchers and rebooking options. Tomorrow morning. Maybe afternoon. Keith stood before she finished her sentence. He had already done the math. 3 hours to get his check bag back. Another hour to find a hotel. A night in unfamiliar sheets. Then another half day lost to waiting. Another apology to Emma over the phone. Another promise to make it up to her. He could already hear her small, careful voice saying it was okay, that she understood, that she'd show him her drawing tomorrow instead. He didn't want tomorrow. Keith walked away from the gate, moving with quiet purpose. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask for a supervisor. He simply went to the airline desk, retrieved his bag, and exited the terminal as if this had been the plan all along. The night air outside the airport was sharp and clean, smelling faintly of jet fuel and rain-soaked asphalt. He paused beside his car, one hand resting on the roof, and exhaled slowly. The drive would be long. 8 hours, maybe more if the roads were bad. He felt the weight of it settle into his shoulders, but beneath the fatigue was something steadier. Control. Keith slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, and pulled out of the parking structure with the radio off. He preferred silence when he drove long distances. Silence made room for thinking, and thinking was something he did carefully. The highway opened ahead of him, lanes stretching into darkness. The world narrowed to headlights, road signs, and the hum of tires against pavement. He drove the speed limit. Always did. Coffee rested untouched in the cup holder for the first hour, steam curling upward. He sipped it only when his eyes began to burn. As miles slipped past, his thoughts returned, inevitably, to home. Emma would be asleep by now. Morin always put her down by 8 on school nights, sometimes earlier if Emma had ballet practice. Keith pictured her room the way it always was when he came home late. Night light glowing softly, stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. Shoes kicked carelessly beside the bed despite repeated reminders. He smiled faintly at that. Routine mattered to him, not because he was rigid, but because routine kept things safe. Predictable. Ordered. Morin liked to tease him about it. You plan for things that never happen, she'd say. He never argued. Planning didn't mean expecting disaster. It meant being ready if something shifted. The road curved, and Keith followed it without conscious thought. Sometime after midnight, he pulled into a rest stop. Bathroom. Stretch. Another coffee. He checked his phone. No missed calls. No messages. That was normal. Morin didn't usually text late, unless something came up. He sent a quick message anyway. Flight got canceled. Driving home. Should be there around 1.30. The message sent. No immediate reply. He slid the phone back into his pocket and returned to the car. The drive resumed. As the clock crept past 1, the fatigue deepened into a dull ache behind his eyes, but he stayed alert. Keith had always been good at managing tiredness. He listened to the sounds of the car, felt the subtle vibrations through the steering wheel, monitored the road with practiced calm. He passed long stretches of darkness where towns slept unseen beyond the trees. Home came into view sooner than he expected. He turned onto his street, headlights washing over familiar houses, all dark and still. Porch lights off, curtains drawn, everything exactly as it should be at this hour. He parked in the driveway and cut the engine. For a moment, he stayed seated, hands resting on his thighs, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The house stood quiet before him. No lights on inside. Good. That meant Morin and Emma were asleep. He gathered his bag and stepped out into the night. The front door opened easily. Keith slipped inside and locked it behind him, the soft click sounding louder than it should have. The house smelled the same, as always, clean laundry, lemon cleaner, something faintly sweet from the candle Morin liked to burn in the evenings. He set his bag down by the stairs and moved through the living room without turning on a light. His feet knew the floor by memory. He paused briefly at the kitchen doorway, noting the counter was clean, dishes put away, the small magnet on the fridge holding up Emma's latest drawing of a crooked sun and 3 stick figures holding hands. He climbed the stairs quietly. At the top, he hesitated. It wasn't a thought yet, more like a sensation, a subtle misalignment, the way a picture frame looked when it had been shifted a fraction of an inch. Keith couldn't have named it if asked, but his body noticed before his mind did. He walked down the hall toward Emma's room. The door was ajar. That by itself meant nothing. Emma sometimes left it open. Sometimes Morin did. Still, Keith stopped just short of the threshold. The night light inside cast a soft glow across the carpet. He stepped forward. The bed was neatly made. No rumpled blankets. No small shape beneath them. No stuffed rabbit tucked under an arm. Keith stood very still. The quiet of the house pressed in around him, heavier now, different than it had been moments before. Something was wrong, and that was where the night truly began. Chapter 2, The Empty Room. Keith stood in the doorway longer than he meant to. Emma's room looked paused rather than lived in, as if someone had pressed a button and stepped away. The night light glowed amber against the wall, illuminating the tidy spread of her blanket, corners tucked with Morin's precise hands. Keith crossed the room slowly, his steps careful, as though noise might disturb something fragile. He placed 2 fingers on the bedspread. Cold. He lifted the blanket anyway, then the sheet beneath it, performing the motion with deliberate calm, even as his chest tightened. Nothing. No warmth. No small, sleeping weight. His eyes moved next, trained, systematic. Backpack hooked by the door. Empty. Shoes usually kicked beneath the desk. Gone. The pink sneakers Emma insisted were faster than any other shoes she owned were not there. Neither were the rain boots she wore even when it wasn't raining. Keith straightened. This wasn't a late-night bathroom trip. This wasn't a nightmare, sending her padding down the hall to climb into her parents' bed. This was absence. He backed out of the room and closed the door gently, as if Emma might be asleep somewhere else and he didn't want to wake her. The thought felt absurd even as it formed. Morin, he called softly. No answer. He walked down the hall toward the master bedroom. The door was closed. He knocked once, then opened it. Morin lay on her side, facing away from him, hair spread across the pillow. She stirred as the light from the hallway cut across the room. "What time is it?" she murmured. "I'm home," Keith said. She rolled on her back, blinking. "I thought you weren't getting in until tomorrow." Flight was canceled. She nodded once, eyes already drifting shut again. "Okay, where's Emma?" The question landed heavier than he intended. Morin's eyes opened fully this time. "She's at Grandma's," she said. The words came too quickly. "I told you." Keith waited. "When?" "I texted you," Morin added. "This afternoon." "I didn't get a text." She sighed, pushing herself upright. "Keith, I sent it. You must have missed it." "I checked," he said evenly. "There's nothing there." Morin reached for her phone on the nightstand, tapping the screen with quick, irritated motions. "I don't know what to tell you. I sent it." "What time did you send her?" "After dinner. Around 7. "Why?" "Because she wanted to go," Morin said, a note of defensiveness creeping in. "She's been asking all week. Mom wanted to see her." Keith nodded once, slowly. "And you didn't think to call me?" "I did text you." He didn't raise his voice. He never did when he was trying to understand something. "We don't send her out on school nights without talking first." Morin folded her arms. "It's one night. It's a Monday. She doesn't have anything tomorrow. She has school. She'll be fine," Morin snapped. "You're making this into something it isn't." Keith studied her face. There were no tears, no worry, only irritation, like he'd woken her for no good reason. "Which grandma?" he asked. Morin hesitated just for a beat. "My mom." Keith felt something tighten further. "I'm going to check." "Check what?" "I'm calling my mother." Morin scoffed. "Why would you?" Keith was already dialing. The phone rang twice before his mother answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Keith? Is everything okay? Did Emma stay with you tonight? A pause. Confusion. No, sweetheart. Why would she? That's all. Go back to sleep. He ended the call and looked at Morin. Her mouth opened, then closed. I'm in my parents', she said. I thought that was obvious. It wasn't. You know what I meant. Keith's voice remained calm, but something cold was forming beneath it. You said, Grandma. We have too. Morin rubbed her temples. Jesus, Keith. It's late. You're tired. She's fine. Why didn't you tell me which one? Because it doesn't matter. It matters to me. Morin swung her legs out of bed. You're being paranoid. The word hung between them. Keith glanced down the hallway toward Emma's room. Paranoid would be assuming something bad without checking. Then stop checking, Morin said sharply. She's with my parents. They've watched her 100 times. When was the last time they had her overnight? Morin stood, pulling on a robe. I don't keep a log. Answer the question. She met his eyes then, irritation hardening into something else he couldn't quite name. Why are you interrogating me? I'm asking where our daughter is. She's safe, Morin said. You need to let this go. Keith took out his phone again. I'm calling your mother. Morin's hand shot out, stopping him. Don't. Why not? She's asleep. So were you. That's different. He waited. Morin didn't move her hand. Move, Keith said quietly. She dropped it. The call went unanswered. Straight to voicemail. Keith left no message. See, Morin said, forcing a laugh. They're asleep. I'm going over there. No, you're not. I am. This is ridiculous, she said, following him into the hallway. You're exhausted. You're seeing problems where there aren't any. Keith stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face her. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize. And if you're right, she demanded. He held her gaze. Then something's wrong. Morin crossed her arms again, the same defensive posture. You don't trust me. I trust patterns, Keith said. And tonight doesn't fit. She shook her head. You always do this. You need everything explained. Controlled. I need consistency. Well, sometimes life isn't consistent. Then we check. Silence stretched between them. The house felt different now. Less like a shelter, more like a structure holding its breath. Morin looked away first. Do whatever you want, she muttered. Just don't wake them up and embarrass me. Keith picked up his keys from the table by the door. He didn't argue further. There was nothing left to say that would clarify what words hadn't already twisted. As he stepped outside, the night air hit him sharp and cold. He closed the door behind him without slamming it, and drove to find the truth himself. Chapter 3, The Garage Light. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive, set back from the road behind a row of dormant trees. Keith slowed as he turned in, headlights sweeping across the front yard. The windows were dark. No porch light, no television glow, nothing to suggest anyone was awake or waiting. He parked near the edge of the drive and cut the engine. The silence that followed felt deliberate. Keith stayed in the car for a moment, listening. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then stopped. The house itself gave nothing away. He checked the time on the dashboard. 1:54 a.m. This is stupid, he murmured, though he didn't believe it. He stepped out, gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes, and approached the front door. He knocked, firm but not loud. Waited. Knocked again. Nothing. He tried the handle. Locked. That, too, meant nothing. They locked up at night. Always had. Keith stepped back, scanning the property. That was when he noticed it. A light. Not from the house, but from the detached garage behind it. A single bulb, glowing dimly through a small side window. It shouldn't have been on. Morin's parents were obsessive about lights. Sue once lectured him for leaving a bathroom lamp on for less than 5 minutes. Keith's chest tightened. He moved toward the garage, each step measured, controlled. The closer he got, the more details emerged. The faint hum of electricity, the thin line of light beneath the door. The rest of the yard lay in shadow. Emma, he called softly. No answer. He reached the garage door and tried the handle. Unlocked. The door creaked as he pulled it open, the sound slicing through the quiet. He froze, listening for movement. There was none, only the low buzz of the bulb overhead. The smell hit him first. Cold concrete, dust, oil, something metallic. Then he saw her. Emma stood near the center of the garage, elevated on a small wooden stool. Her arms were raised above her head, wrists bound together with white zip ties. A rope ran from her hands up over a ceiling beam, taut enough to keep her arms extended. Her head drooped forward, chin pressed to her chest. Her legs trembled visibly, knees locked, toes curled over the edge of the stool, as if she were afraid to move. "Emma," Keith said again, this time louder. Her head lifted slowly. "Daddy." The word came out hoarse, barely more than a breath. Keith crossed the distance to her in 3 strides, dropping to his knees in front of the stool. His hands shook as he took in the details, the raw redness around her wrists, the stiffness in her fingers, the way her shoulders quivered with effort. "How long?" he asked, though his voice nearly failed him. She swallowed. "Since dinner." "What time was that?" She thought for a moment, brow furrowing. The clock said 8. Keith looked at his watch. Almost 6 hours. His jaw tightened so hard it ached. "Okay," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm here. I've got you." He reached for the rope instinctively, then stopped. If he cut it without supporting her, she would fall. He shifted closer, bracing his shoulder against her legs, one arm wrapping around her waist. "I'm going to cut you down," he said. "You might feel dizzy. Just hold on to me, okay?" She nodded weakly. Keith pulled his pocket knife free with his other hand. The blade snapped open with a soft click that sounded too loud in the small space. He sliced through the rope above her hands. The tension released instantly. Emma's knees buckled. Keith caught her full weight as she collapsed against him, the stool clattering backward across the concrete. He lowered them both to the floor, cradling her carefully, shielding her head with one hand as they went down. She clung to his shirt, fingers stiff and uncoordinated. "I couldn't sit," she whispered. "Grandma said I had to stay up." Keith closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. He had to stay present. Rage could wait. "I know," he said quietly. "You're done now. You did nothing wrong." Her breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts. He felt the tremors running through her body, the way her muscles refused to relax even now. He worked quickly, cutting through the zip ties at her wrists. The plastic snapped away, leaving angry red impressions behind. Emma hissed softly as sensation rushed back into her hands. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." He wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, pulling her close, pressing her against his chest. She smelled like dust and sweat and fear. He rocked her gently, not caring if anyone heard, not caring about anything beyond the small, shaking body in his arms. "Did they leave you alone?" he asked. She nodded. "They said it was punishment." "For what?" "For talking back." Keith's vision blurred for a moment. He blinked it away. "Did anyone check on you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Grandpa came in once. He told me not to cry." Keith drew in a slow, controlled breath through his nose. The garage seemed to shrink around them, every shadow sharp, every object suddenly hostile. "I'm taking you home," he said. "Right now." Emma nodded again, then sagged further into him as the adrenaline drained out of her. Her legs no longer held her. Keith adjusted his grip and lifted her carefully. She didn't protest. Her head rested against his shoulder, her arms limp now, exhaustion overtaking fear. As he turned toward the door, he took one last look at the garage, the rope still hanging from the beam, the overturned stool, the quiet bulb casting its indifferent light. There was no misunderstanding left, no explanation that could make this anything other than what it was. And there was no going back from it. Chapter 4. Check Grandpa's car. Keith carried Emma out of the garage and into the cold night, every step deliberate. He adjusted his grip constantly, one arm under her knees, the other braced around her back, making sure her head stayed supported. She was lighter than she should have been. That thought lodged in him like a splinter. He reached his car and opened the passenger door, lowering her gently onto the seat. She winced as her legs straightened. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." He wrapped her in the blanket he kept in the trunk for emergencies, tucking it around her shoulders and feet. Her hands trembled as he guided the seatbelt across her, careful not to brush the red, swollen marks on her wrists. "Does anything hurt?" he asked. "My arms," she said softly, "and my legs feel funny." "That's okay," he said. "They will. You were standing a long time." She nodded, eyes half closed, breathing shallow but steadier now. Keith crouched beside her, keeping his voice calm, even as if they were just coming back from a late practice. "Emma," he said, "I need you to listen to me for a moment." She opened her eyes. "We're going home soon. But before we go, is there anything else I need to know?" She hesitated. Then she leaned forward slightly, as if the words were heavy. "Daddy," she whispered, "check Grandpa's car." Keith's muscles tightened. "What about it?" "Grandma put something in the trunk," Emma said. "A metal box. After dinner, she told Grandpa to move the car closer to the garage." Keith kept his face neutral. "What kind of box?" "Gray. Heavy." Emma swallowed. She said not to touch it. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emma's voice dropped further. "Because it has pictures." Keith felt the air leave his lungs. "Pictures of what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer before she spoke. "Of me." The word landed with quiet finality. Keith straightened slowly, one hand resting on the car door. For a moment, he couldn't move. His thoughts didn't race, they aligned. Clicked into place with terrible clarity. "You did the right thing telling me," he said finally. "I need you to stay right here. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." She nodded, eyes wide now, fear sharpening again. "I'll be right back," he said. He closed the door gently and locked it, testing the handle once to be sure. Then he stood in the driveway, looking at the dark outline of the house, the garage behind it, the quiet that felt suddenly complicit. Grandpa's car sat near the side of the driveway, parked at an angle that suggested it had been moved recently. Keith approached it slowly, every sense alert. No lights flicked on. No doors opened. The house remained silent. He tried the driver's door. Unlocked. Keith opened it and leaned inside, glancing toward the house again before pulling the trunk release. The trunk popped open with a soft mechanical click. He walked to the rear of the car. The trunk was tidy. Too tidy. Emergency kit on one side. Jumper cables coiled neatly. A folded blanket. And beneath it all, tucked against the back wall, a metal case. Rectangular. Industrial. Dull gray, just as Emma had described. It wasn't hidden so much as placed with intention, like something meant to be retrieved later. Keith lifted it. Heavy. He set it down on the driveway and examined it. No markings. No labels. Just a solid latch and a small padlock. His jaw clenched. He returned to his car, retrieved his pocket knife, and knelt beside the case. The lock was cheap. It snapped open with minimal resistance. The lid creaked as he lifted it. Inside were rows of storage devices, SD cards carefully slotted into foam cutouts, each one labeled in black marker with dates and initials. Beneath them lay 2 external hard drives, wrapped in plastic. A stack of manila folders filled the remaining space, edges worn soft with handling. And on top, photographs. Printed, glossy. Keith didn't pick them up at first. He simply stared, his mind refusing to fully process what his eyes confirmed. The images were arranged deliberately, stacked and squared, as though someone had taken care to preserve them. He forced himself to look closer. He recognized Emma instantly, not by what was happening in the pictures, but by her hair, her clothing, the small bracelet she wore on her left wrist. His chest tightened painfully. The images were not chaotic or impulsive. They were framed, documented, repeated. The background changed. The dates on the SD cards suggested pattern and planning. This wasn't punishment. This was recording. Keith closed the lid halfway, then opened it again, methodically checking the contents. He flipped through the folders without fully reading them. Just enough to register structure, lists, schedules, handwritten notes, in careful script. Names appeared more than once. Initials repeated across years. Years. His hands had stopped shaking. Something colder had taken over. He repacked the photographs carefully, placing them back exactly as he'd found them. He closed the lid and secured it, slipping the broken lock into his pocket. Then he stood, case in hand, and looked once more at the house. Everything he believed about this place, about Sunday dinners, forced smiles, casual trust, collapsed under the weight of the metal box in his grip. He carried the case back to his car, opened the trunk, and set it inside. He closed it gently, as if sound itself might alert the night. When he returned to the passenger door, Emma was watching him through the glass. You checked, she said. Yes, Keith replied. He opened the door and knelt beside her again. You were very brave. Her shoulders slumped slightly, relief mixing with exhaustion. Is it bad? Keith didn't lie. It's serious, he said, but it's not your fault. None of it. She nodded, leaning back into the seat. Keith closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. As he got in, he took one last look at the property, the dark windows, the quiet driveway, the garage light still glowing faintly in the distance. The night no longer felt confusing. It felt organized. And that was worse. Chapter 5, The House That Raised Them. Keith had one hand on the driver's door when he heard footsteps behind him. They were deliberate, unhurried, the sound of someone who believed he still had authority. Gravel crunched, slow and steady. You don't leave, Grandpa said. Not with my granddaughter. Keith turned. Grandpa stood near the rear of the car, robe belted tight, jaw set. He looked smaller in the open night than he ever had at the dinner table, but there was no confusion in his eyes, only anger sharpened by fear. She's my daughter, Keith replied. Grandpa scoffed. You married into this family. You don't get to rewrite it. Keith took a step to keep distance between them and the passenger door. Move away from the car. Open the trunk, Grandpa said. Now. Keith didn't move. Grandpa advanced, hand lifting as if to grab him. Keith reacted without thought, pivoting, catching the wrist, twisting just enough to redirect. Grandpa stumbled, surprise flashing across his face. He recovered fast, swinging clumsily. Keith blocked the blow, absorbing it on his forearm. Pain flared, then dulled. He stepped in close, shoulder driving into Grandpa's chest, forcing him back against the quarter panel. Metal dented softly. Stop, Keith said. Not loud. Certain. Grandpa strained, breath hitching. You think you're some hero? I think you don't touch her again. Keith released him and stepped back, hands open. Grandpa leaned on the car, gasping, pride wounded more than anything else. Get away from my family, Grandpa growled. Keith glanced toward the house. A porch light flicked on. Grandma stood in the doorway, silhouetted, robe hanging loose. She took in the scene, the men, the car, Emma watching from inside, and frowned as if annoyed by a mess left unattended. What is this? She asked. He's stealing, Grandpa said, taking things that aren't his. Grandma's eyes slid to Keith, then to the trunk. Something like recognition passed over her face. Oh, she said. Keith's voice was steady. You put the box in the car. Grandma descended the steps slowly. I told you not to open it, she said, as if he'd disobeyed a house rule. You tie my daughter up, Keith said. For hours. She was punished, Grandma replied. Children need consequences. Keith felt his pulse slow, sharpen, standing on a stool with her hands tied to the ceiling. Grandma shrugged. Morin stood longer. The name cut clean. Keith swallowed. You did this to her. Grandma met his gaze. She turned out fine. Did she? Keith asked. Grandpa straightened, finding his voice. This is family business. Family business doesn't involve ropes and cameras, Keith said. Grandma's expression tightened. You don't know what's in that case. I know enough, Keith said, and so does Morin. Grandma exhaled a tired sound. Of course she knows. Keith closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, the night looked different, sharper edges, fewer illusions. How long? He asked. Since she was little, Grandma said. It's how we were raised. And you thought it was acceptable to raise her child the same way. Grandma's chin lifted. We taught her to endure. Keith shook his head. You taught her to normalize it. Grandpa stepped forward again, anger flaring. You walk away with that box, and you destroy lives. Keith met his eyes. You already did. Emma shifted inside the car. Keith moved instinctively to block Grandpa's line of sight to her. Grandma watched the movement and sighed. She'll forget, she said. They always do. Keith felt something settle inside him, cold, permanent. I won't. Grandpa took another step. Keith didn't wait. He opened the driver's door, slid in, and started the engine. The headlights washed over the driveway, over the house that had once felt like part of his life. Grandpa shouted something he didn't hear. Grandma grabbed his arm, holding him back. They stood together, framed by the porch light, faces hard and familiar and utterly foreign. Keith pulled away. The road accepted him without resistance. Emma leaned her head against the window, blanket tucked to her chin. "Daddy," she asked softly. "I'm here," he said. He drove on, the weight of the metal case in the trunk pressing into his awareness. Not just evidence, but confirmation. The house behind them shrank into darkness, taking with it every assumption he'd made about his marriage, his wife's past, and the family he thought he knew. By the time the road curved and the house disappeared completely, Keith understood that nothing from before could be trusted again. Everything had collapsed, and he was already past the point of turning back. Chapter 6: Paper Trails and Wounds. The emergency room lights were too bright for the hour. Keith sat rigid in a molded plastic chair beside Emma's bed, his jacket folded beneath her feet, his phone face down in his lap. Emma lay on her side, blanket tucked around her shoulders, eyes half-lidded as a nurse adjusted the cuff around her arm. "Deep breath, sweetheart," the nurse said gently. Emma obeyed. The cuff tightened. She winced but didn't cry. Keith watched everything. The way the nurse's smile never wavered, the careful distance in the doctor's posture, the notes written with measured neutrality. He recognized the tone immediately. Professional concern. Documentation mode. "How long was she restrained?" the doctor asked. "Approximately 6 hours," Keith replied. He didn't hedge. He didn't soften it. The doctor's pen paused for a fraction of a second. "And the restraints?" "Zip ties at the wrists. Rope over a ceiling beam." The nurse glanced up, her expression tightening before she masked it again. The doctor nodded once. "We'll need to photograph the injuries." Keith nodded back. "Do it." Emma shifted, fingers curling into the blanket. Keith leaned closer. "They're just taking pictures so they can help," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "I don't have to stand, right?" "No," he said. "You don't have to stand ever again." She closed her eyes. The photographs were taken quickly and efficiently. Red marks, swelling, early bruising on the legs. The doctor dictated observations aloud, each word clipped and precise. Keith listened, committing it all to memory. A social worker arrived before the doctor finished. "My name is Karen," she said, pulling a chair closer. "I need to ask you some questions." Keith answered them all. Names, addresses, timelines. He didn't speculate. He didn't editorialize. He gave facts. Karen nodded, jotting notes. "We're mandatory reporters," she said. "CPS and law enforcement have been notified." "I expected that," Keith replied. "Is your wife aware of Emma's injuries?" Keith hesitated only long enough to choose honesty. "She knows where Emma was." Karen studied his face. "Do you feel Emma is safe returning home with you?" "Yes." "Is there any chance your wife would interfere?" He thought of Morin's eyes in the hallway, of her voice calling him paranoid. "Not physically," he said, "but I won't risk it." Karen nodded again. "We'll put safeguards in place." When they were alone again, Emma slept. Keith sat beside her, pulling his laptop from his bag. The metal case sat at his feet, heavier now with context. He opened it carefully, connecting a hard drive to his computer. He created folders, dates, locations, names exactly as written. He copied files twice, once to his laptop, once to an encrypted drive he'd bought years ago for work. He logged every action in a plain text file. Time accessed, device copied, checksum verified. Order steadied him. At 4:12 a.m., his phone vibrated. Morin. He stepped into the hallway before answering. "Where are you?" she demanded. "At the hospital." A pause. "What happened?" "You know what happened." Silence stretched. "Then, you took her there." "Yes." "You didn't have to do that." "I did." Her breath came sharp through the speaker. "My parents are saying you attacked my father." "They're lying." "You don't know that." Keith leaned against the wall. "I know what I saw." "Keith, did you know?" he asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes," Morin said finally. The word was small. Flat. Keith closed his eyes. "How long?" "All my life," she said. "It was normal. It's how they taught us." "Taught you what?" "To behave. To endure. And you sent our daughter there." "I didn't think you did," Keith said. "You chose." Her voice cracked. "I thought it was better than other things." The sentence ended itself. Keith felt something detach cleanly inside him, like a clasp released. "How many times?" "I don't know," she whispered. A lot. Enough, Keith said. You're not taking her from me. I already did. This is my family. Not anymore. He ended the call. Back in the room, Emma stirred. Daddy, I'm here. She reached for his hand. He took it. By morning, a police officer arrived. Then another. Keith gave his statement twice, consistent down to the minute. He provided copies of the files, the photographs, the logs. He watched their faces change as the scope became clear, though they kept their voices level. A CPS supervisor spoke with him privately. We're recommending immediate protective custody with you, she said. Your wife will have supervised contact only. Keith nodded. I'll comply with whatever you need. By noon, Emma was discharged with instructions, referrals, a thick packet of papers. Keith carried her to the car himself. Before driving home, he stopped at a law office recommended by the hospital social worker. He didn't sit. He didn't pace. He stated what he wanted. Emergency divorce filing. Full custody. Protective order. The attorney blinked, then nodded. We can file today. Do it. Papers were signed. Copies made. Dates stamped. When he returned to the car, Emma was asleep again, her breath steady. Keith placed the envelope on the passenger seat beside her, then moved it gently to the glove compartment. As he pulled onto the road, the weight in his chest wasn't grief. It was clarity. The night had taken everything he thought was stable, his marriage, his assumptions, the past he'd trusted without question. What remained was narrower and stronger. His daughter, the truth, and a path forward that required no permission. He drove with both hands on the wheel, already thinking in timelines and checklists, already turning pain into procedure. The reacting was over. Now the work began. Chapter 7, The Network. Keith worked at the kitchen table because it was the largest flat surface in the house. He pushed everything else aside, mail, a bowl of apples, Emma's crayons, and laid the contents out with methodical care. Laptop centered, 2 external drives to the left, the metal case to the right. A legal pad sat open at the top of the table, a pen placed precisely along its spine. It was still early morning, but sleep had been ruled out. Emma was with a therapist arranged through CPS, a short intake session meant only to establish safety. Keith had driven her there himself and waited until she disappeared down the hallway before leaving. When he returned home, the house felt hollowed out, as if it had lost a structural beam. Work steadied him. He started with the SD cards. Each one was labeled in the same hand, block letters, black marker. Dates first, then initials. Some had symbols he didn't recognize at first. A triangle, a slash, a small circle drawn after the letters. Keith photographed every label, logged them, then began indexing. He didn't open files yet. He mapped. Dates stretched backward far beyond Emma's birth. Years stacked on years. He drew a timeline, marking clusters where activity spiked, holidays, summers, long weekends. Patterns emerged quickly. He circled them, then added names as he found them in the documents. Names repeated, not just Mourn's parents, not just one household. Addresses appeared in different towns, different states. Payments were recorded in careful columns, amounts too small to attract attention, too consistent to be casual. Venmo handles, cash notations, church donation envelopes repurposed as receipts. Church. Keith paused there, pen hovering. He scanned again, slower this time. Youth programs. A volunteer schedule. A name he recognized from Emma's soccer league appeared twice, once next to a date, once next to a set of initials he now associated with a different victim. His jaw tightened. He opened one folder labeled Simply Logs. Inside were spreadsheets printed and annotated by hand. Rotations. Availability. Notes like family in town or used garage. It wasn't chaotic. It was managed. This isn't a monster, Keith murmured to the empty room. It's an operation. He began opening files. He did it the way the doctor had instructed him at the hospital. Slow, with breaks, grounding himself in facts. The images were exactly what he feared and no worse than he expected, which somehow made it worse. There was no frenzy here, no lack of control. Everything was deliberate, repeated, recorded. He documented without commentary. File name, date, individuals present, location markers. He He didn't assign motive. He didn't speculate. He built a ledger of truth. Hours passed unnoticed. By early afternoon, the network took shape. At least 12 perpetrators, possibly more, obscured behind initials and burner accounts. At least 19 victims, some appearing briefly, others over long stretches. The earliest dated back more than 20 years. 20. Keith leaned back, chair creaking. His eyes burned. He stood, stretched, then returned to the table and wrote one line at the top of a new page. This did not start with my family. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. Keith Rice. There was a pause on the other end. Breathing. Measured. My name is Kathleen Pike, a woman said. I think you have something that belongs to me. Keith's pulse quickened, but his voice stayed level. What makes you say that? I saw my name in a police report, she replied. They didn't know what it meant. I did. Keith glanced down at the list of victims. Kathleen Pike. The name was there, paired with dates from 15 years ago. How did you get this number? He asked. From a detective, she said. He told me you were the one who found it. Keith closed his eyes briefly. Are you safe right now? Yes, she said. I've been for a long time, but others weren't. Tell me what you know, Keith said. They spoke for nearly an hour. Kathleen's voice was steady, practiced. She didn't dramatize. She named places, people, routines. She described the same symbols Keith had circled on his pad, the same scheduling rhythms. She spoke of silence taught early, of trust weaponized. I kept a diary, she said near the end. I didn't know why at the time. I just knew I needed to remember what they told me not to. Do you still have it? Keith asked. Yes. And you're willing to share it. There was another pause. With you, she said. Yes. They arranged a drop through counsel, no direct meeting. When the call ended, Keith sat still for a long time, listening to the quiet house. By evening, the diary arrived as scanned files, accompanied by photographs Kathleen had kept hidden for years. Keith integrated them carefully, cross-referencing dates. Every entry corroborated something he'd already found. The scope widened again. This wasn't just family violence. This wasn't even just a group of offenders. It was infrastructure. Keith updated his summary document, the language stripped of emotion. Findings indicate an organized, multi-location abuse network operating for over 2 decades, involving trusted community figures and systematic documentation. He read the sentence twice, then saved it. When Emma returned home that night, tired and quiet, Keith closed the laptop and put everything away. He made her soup. He sat with her while she ate. He listened when she talked about the therapist's office and the plant by the window and how the chair squeaked. Later, after she slept, he returned to the table. The house no longer felt hollow. It felt charged. What had begun as a single lie had unfolded into something vast and deeply rooted. Keith looked at the names, the dates, the connections drawn in ink and data. This wasn't about one child. It never had been. And now that he could see the whole shape of it, he understood something else just as clearly. It would not fall on its own. Chapter 8. Pressure and Collapse. Keith didn't act impulsively. He had learned long ago that control was power, and the network he had uncovered thrived on secrecy, trust, and fear. He needed neither weapons nor authority. He had patience, planning, and leverage. It began small. A brown envelope slipped under a door. Inside, a single printed photograph of one of the abusers, time-stamped and annotated. No signature, no explanation, only the image. He watched the ripple effect carefully. Weeks later, another envelope arrived at a different house, a printed schedule, incomplete but enough to unsettle. A car parked too long in a driveway, a phone call tracing back to no one in particular. Messages designed to imply observation. Keith kept meticulous records. Every envelope, every photograph, every digital breadcrumb. He logged dates, times, reactions noted in public. Cars moved suddenly, lights flicked on earlier than usual, doors checked repeatedly. He called it psychological leverage, and it worked with precision. One morning, he received a call from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game," said a voice, low and tense. Keith's voice was calm. "I'm aware." You have no idea who you're dealing with. Try me. A pause, then the sound of a gun cocking. Keith's heart rate ticked upward briefly, but he didn't move. If that's your decision, make it count. The line went dead. He traced it as far as he could, careful not to reveal his position. The voice would think him powerless. That was part of the plan. Across town, rumors began to appear in conversations between abusers. Someone had seen documents. Someone heard a confession. They checked each other, looking for errors, for leaks. Keith had no need to confront them directly. Their own paranoia was dismantling the network. He watched one member, a man deeply embedded in local youth sports, flip entirely. He moved his children, suddenly canceled practices, and then disappeared for days. His absence wasn't publicized, but the ripple was enough to frighten others who depended on schedules and coordination. Keith adjusted his approach constantly, based on their reactions. Too aggressive, and the network might retaliate. Too slow, and they would bury evidence. His fingers flew over the laptop keys late into the night, setting up anonymous emails, scheduling mail drops, ensuring each move felt accidental. He sent a package to a family in the suburbs. A series of printouts showing dates, names, and initials, carefully arranged to imply someone was tracking the network from inside. No addresses, no sender. Only implication. Within hours, one member called another, questions shouted, suspicions rising. By the next morning, the whispers had escalated to confrontation. Keith watched carefully as members began turning on each other. Accusations arose over small errors. A photo dated incorrectly, a note misfiled, a phone call traced too far. Their internal cohesion eroded rapidly. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was inevitable. Panic became a tool as effective as a weapon. Fear was a lever, and Keith pulled it patiently. He recorded every instance, cataloging reactions, tracing the breakdowns like a scientist observing a chain reaction. One member fled the city entirely, leaving behind schedules, devices, and personal effects. Another, angry, panicked, showed up at Keith's workplace, gun in hand, shouting accusations. Security cameras captured everything. Keith remained calm, talking slowly, keeping the man on the line until law enforcement arrived. The man surrendered without firing a shot. Keith never approached anyone physically. His interactions were almost entirely indirect. A message, a package, a subtle suggestion in a public space was enough to set off chains of doubt and paranoia. Members accused each other, confronted each other, and confessed in fear of exposure. Even those not directly threatened began changing behavior. Meetings were canceled. Payments went unpaid. Communications ceased. The network shrank within itself, a self-inflicted collapse. Through it all, Keith maintained the ledger. Each envelope, each interaction, each reaction was logged in detail. Names, dates, locations, methods, and outcomes meticulously recorded. He built a timeline showing cause and effect, how each anonymous pressure point led to breakdowns within network. By the end of the month, what had been a tightly coordinated group functioning over decades had begun to fracture. Trust dissolved. Coordination failed. Individuals became isolated and paranoid. The psychological dominoes fell with frightening regularity. Keith knew that law enforcement had only begun to scratch the surface of what he had uncovered. But by destabilizing the network first, he ensured that evidence would be preserved, witnesses would emerge, and confessions would surface naturally. He sat back one night, laptop open, fingers tracing the lines he had drawn between people, dates, and actions. The names, initials, and locations formed a lattice of exposure. The network's collapse was evident. One house empty, one member hiding, another begging for legal counsel, another calling law enforcement under anonymous pretense. Keith's hands didn't shake. His face didn't betray the intensity of what he had orchestrated. Every move had been deliberate, every pressure point calculated. He felt satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. He thought of Emma, asleep in her room, safe for now. She had no idea of the scale, of the meticulous unraveling he was controlling from behind the scenes. She didn't need to. His job was to protect, to dismantle, and to preserve evidence for those who could prosecute. Even his subtle victories, emails unanswered, phones dropped, schedules misfiled, felt significant. The network could no longer operate as it had. Suspicion had become the binding agent between them, stronger than any loyalty they once felt. Keith prepared for the next steps methodically. Each package, each email, each indirect confrontation was mapped in a schedule. He calculated timing down to the hour, ensuring every move would maximize pressure without triggering outright violence against his daughter or himself. By the time the sun rose, the network was a fractured shell of itself. Members no longer coordinated, no longer trusted. Confessions had begun to surface indirectly. Neighbors had overheard arguments, coworkers had reported sudden disappearances, and phone calls suggested admissions made under duress. Keith allowed himself a brief pause. He leaned back in his chair, reviewing his notes. Every domino had fallen exactly as he had planned. The chaos he had sown was silent, almost invisible to outsiders, but complete. He didn't celebrate. There was no room for celebration. The work was not finished, but the critical first step, turning fear and precision into an instrument of collapse, had succeeded. He glanced toward Emma's room. The quiet was a fragile shield against the darkness of what he was dismantling. Keith understood the gravity. This network could have gone unnoticed forever if not for his intervention. And even now, the consequences would ripple far beyond what he could predict. He returned to the ledger, adding one final note for the night. Network destabilized. Confessions emerging. One member fled. One armed threat neutralized. Paranoia achieved. Operational collapse underway. Keith closed the laptop. The night outside was still, the house settled. But the world he had shaken was shifting. And in the quiet, he allowed himself one thought. Control, patience, precision, justice could be surgical if wielded correctly. The network was crumbling, and he had done it without firing a shot. The ripple effect had begun. Confessions, whispers, paranoia. The structure of decades was unraveling. And that was enough to ensure that the law, when it intervened, would arrive at a foundation already cracking. Chapter 9, The Reckoning. Keith didn't sleep the night he made the call. Not because of fear, not because of uncertainty, but because he needed to make sure every piece of evidence, every file, every photograph and document was accounted for. The metal case sat open on the kitchen table, its contents meticulously organized, double-checked, cross-referenced against his digital ledger. Every SD card labeled. Every hard drive verified with checksums. Every folder numbered and logged. By dawn, he was ready. The call to the FBI was precise. Special Agent Harris? Keith's voice was calm, controlled. I have material evidence of a multi-state child abuse network. Organized. Systematic. Immediate intervention required. There was a pause. Then, a voice, clipped and professional. Mr. Rice, we'll need specifics. Location, contents, chain of custody. Keith outlined everything. Locations of the original materials, dates, names, connections. He explained the steps he had taken to preserve the evidence, including the copies he had maintained in encrypted storage. He described the psychological destabilization he had orchestrated against the network, ensuring its members could no longer hide or coordinate. Understand your methods, the agent said finally. Given the circumstances, we'll take custody. You need to come in and provide full testimony. And Mr. Rice, you'll need legal counsel. Keith paused only long enough to say, I'm aware. I've consulted already. He arranged for the FBI to take possession the next morning. Agents arrived in unmarked vehicles, several SUVs pulling into his driveway. Keith met them at the door, guiding them to the case. He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. Every item had been documented, cataloged, photographed, duplicated. Everything in here is exactly as I found it, he said, keeping his tone steady. Chains of evidence are maintained. The agents nodded, inspecting the files, SD cards, and photographs. Keith observed silently. He was neither triumphant nor relieved. The weight of what had been uncovered pressed on him still, heavier than any physical object. One agent looked up. "You realize you may have violated state law in taking this evidence." "I understand," Keith replied. "Given the danger to the child and the network sophistication, I had no choice. Evidence integrity was the priority. Immediate threat to the victims required action." The agent's expression softened slightly. "Under exigent circumstances, you may avoid charges. We'll need full statements, but legally, your intervention is defensible." Keith nodded. "Then we begin." From that point, the investigation accelerated. Nationwide, arrests were made. Local law enforcement units collaborated with the FBI, using the materials Keith had preserved to corroborate witness accounts, identify perpetrators, and locate victims. Across states, homes were raided, records seized, and suspects questioned under oath. Media outlets picked up the story. Headlines were unavoidable. Child abuse network exposed. Nationwide arrests follow meticulous vigilante action. FBI uncovers decades-long abuse conspiracy. Keith stayed out of the cameras, letting the agents handle public statements. He refused interviews. Privacy for Emma was paramount. Trials were long, emotional, and carefully documented. The grandparents, Sue and Willie, were the first to be sentenced. Evidence included photographs, spreadsheets, schedules, and Kathleen Pike's corroborating diary. Their courtroom demeanor oscillated between denial and defiance, but the weight of the documented evidence was incontrovertible. "Life without parole," the judge said, reading the sentence slowly. The words landed like hammers. Keith felt nothing. Relief, maybe, but not satisfaction, not joy, only the sense that a correct accounting had been made. Justice had not been theatrical. It had been precise. Other members of the network, once thought untouchable in their communities, received sentences ranging from 35 to 45 years. Each sentence was accompanied by testimony, evidence presentation, and corroboration from multiple victims. The process was slow but deliberate, ensuring that the law, not emotion or vengeance, was the instrument of consequence. Morin's trial was separate. Keith attended only briefly, enough to witness the formalities. She was convicted on charges of child endangerment and complicity, receiving 12 years. The judge emphasized her failure to protect her child despite knowledge of the network, and her complicity in perpetuating the abuse. Emma's presence was never required in the courtroom. She remained in protective custody, her location known only to trusted authorities. Kathleen Pike entered witness protection along with her family. Keith coordinated closely with law enforcement and social services to ensure that both girls' identities and safety were preserved. Keith continued documenting each phase of the process. He kept his own ledger, dates of arrest, charges filed, trial outcomes, and sentences. He archived media coverage, transcripts, and all communications. The record was complete, a final testament to the chain of events that had begun with a canceled flight in an empty bedroom. Late one night, as Keith reviewed the case files, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. It wasn't triumph he felt, not pride, not relief in the sense of emotional closure. It was clarity. The network had been dismantled, its members incarcerated, its operations halted. The evidence had been preserved for future investigations. Victims had support and protection, but the darkness from which it all emerged remained. Keith knew the scope of abuse, the years it had continued, the lives quietly affected could never be erased. The legal system could impose sentences, but it could not undo trauma. He closed the laptop and looked toward the room where Emma slept, peaceful for the first time in months. She was safe, protected, the immediate threat neutralized. Keith allowed himself a deep, slow breath. The metal case, once a symbol of horror, was now a record of accountability. Each file, each photograph, each ledger entry had done its part to ensure justice. He didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no triumphant music in his head, only the quiet knowledge that the network was broken, the perpetrators held responsible, and the victims shielded from further harm. The FBI had taken custody of all materials. Keith's careful documentation had ensured that no evidence was lost, no details overlooked. He had not acted rashly, but deliberately, strategically. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the intricate collapse of a 20-year conspiracy that had just concluded its first chapter of legal reckoning. Inside, Keith remained seated at the table, reviewing notes one last time. He made a final entry in his personal ledger. All core network members arrested. Materials handed to FBI. Victims in protective custody. Trials concluded. Sentences imposed. Legal resolution achieved. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. The case was no longer his to manage. He had done his part, precise, controlled, and meticulous. The law would now carry the weight of consequence. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, he felt the faintest exhale of relief, not triumph, not victory, but the recognition that the structure of justice, however imperfect, had been executed. Emma and Kathleen were safe. The network was dismantled. The trials were complete. The reckoning, in all its grim clarity, had arrived. Chapter 10, What Remains. The first morning in their new home was quiet in a way Keith hadn't realized he missed. The sun filtered through light gray curtains, falling across the hardwood floor in neat lines. Emma lay under her comforter, curled like a small bird, breathing evenly. Keith sat in the recliner nearby, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, his laptop open but untouched. For the first time in weeks, he felt no pressing obligation beyond watching her breathe. "Morning, Dad," Emma murmured, still half asleep. "Morning," Keith replied softly. "Sleep well." She nodded. "The bed doesn't squeak like the old one." Keith smiled faintly. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Good. That's progress." Breakfast was slow and quiet. Emma picked at her eggs, asked about school only briefly, and mostly listened as Keith recounted mundane things: weather, the route to her new school, the way the bus would stop near the park. Nothing about the past. Nothing about the case. She didn't need it. Not yet. After breakfast, Keith drove her to her first therapy session at the new clinic. The building was modern but welcoming, a soft palette of greens and blues on the walls. A receptionist greeted them warmly, asking nothing beyond names and appointments. "Are you nervous?" Keith asked as they sat in the waiting area. "A little," Emma admitted, "but I think I'll like it here." "That's good. You'll get to tell someone all the stuff you need to, and they'll help make it less heavy," Keith said. She nodded again, small but determined. Keith's chest tightened. The weight of the last months, the garage, the ropes, the lies, the betrayal hadn't disappeared. It wouldn't. But here, she could begin to rebuild herself, and he could begin to rebuild the pieces of life that had once felt irreparably broken. Once the session started, Keith left quietly. He walked outside, inhaling deeply. The neighborhood was quiet. A few cars, a dog barking in the distance, the hum of a city waking up but not demanding attention. He glanced at his phone. No calls from old contacts. No new threats. Only a message from the FBI confirming that the final materials had been logged and archived. The network was gone. The court orders were in place. Morin had no custody rights. Keith allowed himself a moment. Relief. Not victory. Not triumph. Just a moment. Back home, he began the slow work of unpacking, organizing, and creating a sense of normalcy. Clothes hung in closets, dishes arranged neatly, boxes of Emma's belongings sorted into bins labeled with markers. He moved carefully, methodical as always, aware that each action was a building block in a life that had to feel safe, solid, and predictable. In the evenings, he and Emma ate together, talked about school, drew small sketches, played board games. Sometimes she laughed freely. Sometimes the memories of the past crept back, and she was quiet, staring into space. Keith learned to sit beside her without pushing, letting her grief and fear have space while silently assuring her she was safe. Weeks passed. Keith contacted the school, established new routines, met Emma's teachers. He volunteered for a few after-school activities, not to control them, but to observe, to protect. Always in the background, never visible, always vigilant. The trauma had made him more attentive, not less. One night, months after their move, Keith sat at the dining table alone. Emma was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet but alive with soft creaks and hums of appliances. He opened a fresh notebook, not for evidence or cases, but for thoughts, observations, and reminders. Names of contacts, notes on ongoing investigations, lessons learned from the network dismantling. Even in safety, he knew vigilance was permanent. A phone call broke the silence. Detective Miller, a voice said, "I don't know if you remember me, but there's a case I think you should see. Sensitive, ongoing. I heard you've been thorough in the past." Keith's fingers tightened on the receiver. He didn't rise from a chair, didn't smile, didn't flinch. He only listened. "What kind of case?" he asked. "Child exploitation. Different state. But the patterns, it reminded me of what you uncovered before. We could use your insight." Keith nodded slowly, though the detective couldn't see him. "Send the files. I'll review them. That's all I ask. We don't want to alert anyone prematurely." Keith hung up, staring at the wall. The quiet house felt heavier now, not with fear, but with responsibility. He realized then that protection was not a phase, not a temporary duty. It was a calling, permanent and personal. He walked upstairs to Emma's room. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling evenly, small hands tucked beneath her chin. He brushed back her hair, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered, "I've got you. Always." Downstairs, he returned to the table, notebook open. The new case waited in digital form on his laptop, files encrypted and ready for analysis. He began to read, meticulously, methodically. Patterns emerged, as they always did. Connections, schedules, anomalies. Keith's mind had sharpened from the months of unraveling the prior network. His expertise was precise, unemotional, surgical. Even as he worked, the city outside began its nocturnal rhythms. Traffic, sirens, distant voices. The life of the world went on, unaware of the small battles being fought in quiet houses, behind closed doors, in the careful logging of facts and patterns. Keith paused for a moment, looking at the lines of code, the spreadsheets, the cross-reference dates. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't spectacle. This was prevention. Protection. He closed the laptop briefly, took a deep breath, and exhaled slowly. Emma would wake in the morning. She would eat breakfast. She would go to school. And somewhere in the shadows, Keith would continue the work of keeping her safe, keeping others safe, making sure the dark patterns he had seen could never expand unchecked again. The past was heavy, but the present was manageable. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt prepared to meet it. He glanced at the notebook on the table. At the bottom of the page, he wrote in neat block letters, "Protection is permanent. Vigilance never ends." Keith closed the notebook. He turned off the light, leaving the lamp by the table glowing faintly. Outside, the neighborhood was silent, but his mind was alert. Patterns, schedules, names, connections, he cataloged them in his mind as he walked to the window. In that quiet, he allowed himself a faint, measured hope. Emma was healing. Kathleen and other victims were protected. The network had been dismantled. Justice had been executed. And yet, he knew that darkness never rested. The vigilance, the watchfulness, the responsibility that would remain with him forever. The house was quiet. The city was quiet. But Keith knew better. Quiet was only temporary. The fight, the protection, the vigilance, those were permanent. He returned to his chair, notebook beside him, eyes focused on the files waiting in the laptop. The world outside moved on. He moved with it, vigilant, methodical, unwavering. The chapter may have ended for Emma, but for Keith, the work of safeguarding those who could not protect themselves had just become a permanent calling. And in the quiet, he accepted it fully. The story of what had happened, what had been exposed, and what had been dismantled, those events would fade from the headlines. But the responsibility, the vigilance, and the protection, those remained. Always.